So when we look at the foundations of this, there are a couple of key things that I'd like to highlight here. And that is really understanding that throughout pregnancy and into the first years of life, our right brain is rapidly growing and developing. So at a very simplistic level, right hemisphere is involved in our senses, so sight, sound, smell, sensations of touch, movement, for example, but also emotional learning and memory, and it's also where trauma is stored. In the first couple years of our life, that right brain is rapidly growing and developing, and that growth, not surprisingly, based on what this part of our brain focuses on, is directly impacted by sight, sound, smell, sensations of touch, movement. The baby's developing brain is directly impacted by mom's experiences and stress states, particularly in the first year and in utero, because it can hear and feel in utero. So, fighting and violence or calm and happy. These things help to determine how our nervous system and brain begin growing and developing. Third to fourth year of life is when left hemisphere more fully comes online and begins going into a more active period of growth and development. So, left hemisphere, I often refer to as the meaning making part of our brain. Left hemisphere likes to make sense out of things, to understand things. It likes sequence and order and logic, right? This is our higher order rationalization, cause and effect, and our executive functions. But really, in the earliest and most vulnerable years of our life, it's the right hemisphere that's rapidly growing and developing, with the left hemisphere coming online increasingly more so, moving forward from the third to fourth year of life. Within the first year, our brain doubles in size. It grows over 100% in that first year and drops off to about 18% in the second year. Now, five sixths of that brain development is attachment driven. Am I picked up? Am I rocked? Am I held? Does somebody lovingly look into my eyes? As I said, this is like a stress inoculation for the developing brain, and it just is helping to optimize that brain growth and development that then moves forward and helps us throughout our lifespan. Those attachment relationships facilitate the critical development of the brain's self-regulatory mechanisms. So when we look at things like the limbic system and the HPA stress axis, which you might have heard of, when we look at our ability to emotionally regulate or manage our feelings or emotions, this ties in with that brain growth and development. When we have experiences of soothing, loving care, nurturing movement, attunement, attention, all of these allow for experiences of regulation. When we don't have these, quite often people know that they don't feel okay, but they don't necessarily know how to fix it, right? So oftentimes what we see is there's activation without the ability to regulate that activation. So we may see people become predisposed towards hypoarousal or hyperarousal. So hyperarousal and hypoarousal we'll talk about in just a moment. But essentially, what's happening is people are gravitating towards external methods of soothing in attempt to try to feel better, but they don't necessarily know what to do in a safe and healthy way to shift that affective state. The other thing that's important to note is there has been a lot of thought around spoiling babies or giving babies too much attention, and the research really shows us that there is no such thing. Attachment grows the developing brain. Babies are not able to self-regulate. They're entirely reliant on their caregivers to help promote regulation. When left to cry, a baby doesn't know when you leave the room, that you're coming back. They can't see you, hear you, feel you, smell you. They don't have a sense of object permanence. So when they're crying out, it's because they need something, and and that's their only method of communication. When they're left to cry, what happens is what's called dorsal vagal shutdown, and their little nervous systems are flooded with stress hormones and chemicals, including cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And their body is flooded with tremendous pain that it doesn't know how to navigate. So they shut down, right, and disconnect. And it's a protective, adaptive, survival-driven response. When caregivers are not consistently available or attuned or are non-responsive, this can trigger a threat response within the developing brain. So all of these things are important markers for how the world is, how I am in the world, whether I'm safe, whether I'm not safe. And when a caregiver's face is non responsive or frightened or frightening, it triggers a big uh-oh response in the threat detection part of the brain, where we know something is very wrong here, but we also don't have the capacity to fix it. The other thing that can be so, so important is prosody. So, our pitch, our tone, our cadence of voice, right? The pace of our speech, all of these things can help to communicate regulation and connection, comfort, safety, or activation and hyperarousal. When we work with the window of tolerance, part of the work that we're doing is understanding that we have this optimal arousal zone. And in this optimal arousal zone, we have the ability to kind of ebb and flow throughout life. However, some things will make us come close to the edges of too much, and some things will make us come close to the edges of too little, right? Sometimes that too much might be I have an exam or I have to do a speech in public and I'm not comfortable with that. So, what can happen is we can have this big body response, right? Big energy in the body, big energy in the nervous system, and we can feel it and we can feel that excess energy. But after that event passes and the arousal comes down, we're generally re regulating again. Another example is when we feel too close to the edges of stuck on off or having too little energy. I often think of bereavement as an example of this, where when we experience loss, quite often it is also emotionally and physically draining and exhausting, and people are very tired. Now, over time, our nervous system re regulates a bit, right? Similarly, if we have insomnia for a couple of nights, if we have trouble sleeping over time, when our sleep patterns resume, we re regulate. But for trauma, this drastically seems to bring people outside of that window of tolerance and causes people to become stuck on or stuck on off, or most often what we see is oscillating between the two. So flipping between the two. When we're stuck on, think of too much. So gas pedal fully pressed, excess energy, we're on high alert, our nervous systems are kind of revving high. And here it can feel like anxiety, panic, hyperactivity, those startle responses, an inability to relax, restlessness, hypervigilance, digestive problems, emotional flooding, chronic pain, sleeplessness, hostility, and rage. When we're stuck on off, think of too little, or that brake is fully pressed, right? And here we're exhausted, lethargic. It's effortful even to hold my body up. We see things like depression or flat affect, lethargy, a sense of deadness or disconnection, disorientation, dissociation can occur here, complex syndromes, pain, low blood pressure, poor digestion. So part of what we want to better understand, and this is really the lens that our model works through, is helping people to understand what's happening in their nervous system and how can we regulate it, right? Are we gravitating to a certain um, approach to a certain external method of soothing to discharge excess energy, right? Or are we gravitating towards it to increase energy because we feel shut down, lethargic, emotionally dead inside? How we target treatment will vary depending on where we are in that window of tolerance and what's needed at that affect regulation perspective. Part of that work is also understanding a little bit about what happens in the brain when we're stressed or when we experience trauma. And Dan Siegel has a really great model of the hand brain concept called flipping your lid. And there's some further information about that on our website and an infographic on our website as well. But ultimately, he says, we know the brain develops from the bottom up and the inside out. And he says, if you look at the hand as a model of our brain that develops from the bottom up and the inside out, the base here would be our brain stem at a simplistic level. So the brain stem is involved in fight, flight, freeze responses, but it's also involved with a lot of the autonomic functions that we don't really have to think about. So Bessel van der Kolk calls this the housekeeping part of the brain. Then we have, so like breathing, heart rate, digestion, right, blood pressure, all of these things that we don't have to think about doing. Our body just does it for us, which is actually pretty remarkable. We then have this kind of mid part of our brain. This is the next part of our brain to more fully grow and develop. And here we have things like our limbic system, which is our emotional regulatory boss, the amygdala, which is our personal security guard or threat detection center, the hippocampus, which is responsible for learning and memory, and essentially is like our own personal Google of the brain. It helps us to scan through memories and find the information that we're looking for. The older we are, the longer sometimes it can take. The less emotionally significant, the longer it can take. The stuff that's more emotionally charged tends to come up a little bit faster, or the stuff that we've revisited or thought about often. The last part of the brain to more fully grow and develop is the prefrontal part of the brain. So this part of our brain is like the wise leader or the higher order part of our brain that allows us to really reflect on things. It's our logic, our reason, our rationalization, cause and effect, executive functions. And this is a really wonderful part of our brain, but it's still growing and really goes into a peak period of growth and development in adolescence and into adulthood. So it's quite often our expectations of children and youth is not really on par with what we have available, right, neurologically. But Dan Siegel says what happens is when we have emotions that are big down here in the brainstem and in the midbrain, it causes us to flip our lid. And when we flip our lid, we lose access to logic, reason, rationalization, cause and effect, and all of those great strategies that we may have learned in therapy or other resources. And what happens is essentially that thinking part of our brain is largely going offline. So it may be difficult to talk. It may be difficult to reason, to explore cause and effect. What is going to get through in those moments when we flipped our lid, however, are sensory strategies. So our sights, sounds, smells, sensations of touch, nurturing movement. Again, we're working with the senses and the movement and the emotions to try and shift that affective state, bring the arousal down, and then we're able to engage that higher order, more logical, rational part of the brain. So when we look at this again through an attachment lens, we understand, and this is Alan Shore's work, from infancy throughout all stages of the lifespan, this early evolving right lateralized system is centrally involved in implicit processes and in the control of vital functions, supporting survival and enabling the organism to cope with stress and challenges. So what this means is at a very deep subconscious level, this is my understanding of who I am, how I relate to the world, and how I need to adapt to survive. And the brain and the nervous system are constantly adapting itself in relation to the environment and what is happening. So if we learn that the world is dangerous, that people don't listen when I cry out, that harm happens, I'll adapt towards that to learn what is going to keep me most safe and help me navigate this threat. If I learn that the world is a safe place, people listen when I speak, comfort comes when I signal distress, I'm being primed for a very different template in life. And we'll see very different actual presentations, even as young as little toddlers, right? Going or children going into JK and SK. We'll see very different templates of relating happening because our foundations, our understanding of the world and how we relate to people are quite different. We also know that our life experiences are part of what shape our brain, but it's also the timing of what happens when. So sometimes there's this idea that the younger we are, the more resilient we are, and that couldn't be further from the truth. The younger we are, the more brain growth and development there is happening. The more brain growth and development there is happening, the more potential impact we can have on the brain. So when trauma occurs, it has the capacity to inhibit or prevent growth or development, right? So because we have so much volume that's growing in the brain, the younger we are, the more potential brain regions we have that can be impacted, right? So children are not magically resilient because they can't talk about what happened or because they might not consciously remember what happened. It's there, it's stored in the nervous system, the brain, and the body. And a lot of times we see this in the later life adaptations or survival driven behaviors that we see. So when we look at how our brain kind of grows and develops and how we grow in development, um, we have these critical and sensitive developmental periods. We have trauma, right, which can also be called adverse childhood experiences. So these adverse childhood experiences, and this is not an exhaustive list, but it is based on the initial adverse childhood experiences study, look at things that happen in the earliest years of our life and in the first 18 years of our life that have a significant impact on later life health outcomes, including our physical health. Yes, our mental health, yes, our lifestyle behaviors, but it's all interconnected, right? And we also have genetics. So there is the intergenerational transmission of trauma ties in here. We can now trace the intergenerational transmission of trauma and resilience to up to 4 generations. So that means it's not just what's happened to me, it's also what's happened to my parents on both sides, to their parents on both sides, their parents' parents, their parents' parents' parents, or so that's a lot of people when we look at what was happening. Were they experiencing war? Were they experiencing famine? Was there colonization? Was there interpersonal violence or trauma happening within the home? What was happening in their world? Because this works with the nervous system and the brain in addition to these other factors. And all of this filters in to grow our brain, right, at an electrical, chemical, cellular, and mass level. Out of this, we have these adaptations that are survival driven adaptations. As I said, the brain and the body is constantly adapting itself to what's happening around it. And from here, we can see things like chronic disease and psychiatric disorders and impaired cognition, difficulty with workplace and school performance, attendance, but also our concentration. It's really, really hard to learn when we're actively in this state of arousal, scanning for threat. It impacts obesity, high risk behaviors, use of alcohol, drugs, tobacco, risky sexual behavior, crime, poverty. And of course, we see that intergenerational transmission of trauma and disparity that can be passed down from one generation to the next. This resource comes from what's called the CAN narratives, the childhood adversity narratives. And it's a really excellent resource to have a look at if you'd like to dive a little bit deeper. And also the adverse childhood experiences study is an incredible resource as well. But essentially what's happening is this is shaping the way that our brain and nervous system are growing and developing. And it's considered to have, these ACEs are considered to have what's called a dose response effect on later life health outcomes. Timing is also really important. So the other thing that the CAN narratives studies showed was that, the bulk of abuse and neglect that we see also happens at our most vulnerable age. So 0 to 3 by far is the highest rate of abuse and neglect. that also is overlapping that rapid period of brain growth and development, as well as attachment formation. As we get a little bit older, the rates of abuse gradually decline, but quite significantly after the age of 3. The type of abuse as well varies quite significantly. So we see neglect, which could also be considered attachment trauma, is by far the most prevalent type of abuse, followed by physical abuse, psychological maltreatment, sexual abuse first, then psychological maltreatment, and then lastly, medical neglect. And quite often when we see medical neglect, the rest of it is happening as well, or certainly other elements of abuse are happening as well. It just may not be what's flagging the attention at that time. So again, Alan Shore says timing matters. If you expose a 9-year-old child or a 29-year-old child to an attachment stressor, say the loss of an important emotional relationship, you'll see an established system become disorganized and regressive with a temporary loss of function. But on the other hand, if you stress the system at, for example, 9 months of age, while it's still in a critical period of growth and development, you will alter the trajectory of its development, right? So because our brain is growing and developing, because those brain regions are vulnerable to stress and trauma, there's a greater potential for impact. Our model that we use at Attach Niagara is all about, therefore, attending to the fire. So really understanding what are the underlying associations, patterns of relating, patterns of behaving, patterns of engaging with my body, with the world around me that are there, right? We know that all too often systems treat the smoke. They treat the eating disorder, the cutting, the high risk behavior, right? And that's all really important. But unless we're getting at those underlying issues, it's almost like a Band-Aid solution, right? So we need to be able to get at that fire and tend to the fire. What's causing or driving the need to cut or use or binge or purge or die, right? What's causing the tremendous pain, and how can we get into that and work through it in a safe, structured manner, which is what our model is all about. So trauma shapes the lens through which we view the world, how we see ourselves, how we see others, how we relate to others, how it feels to be in our body, how it feels to be in our mind, and how could it not? And with this in mind, I often come back to some of the leading experts in trauma work that really have shifted away from a more of a diagnostic lens to a lens of affect dysregulation or affect regulation, right? Seeing this occur along a spectrum of, dysregulated maybe to regulated, experiences of extreme stress and how those extreme stress experiences shape and impact where we are on that affect regulation spectrum. Our treatment model at the Attachment and Trauma Treatment Center for Healing, Niagara, is based on a triphasic model. So we look at phase 1, which would be our safety, education, stabilization, and symptom reduction. Phase 2 would be more of that trauma processing and reappraisal work. And then phase 3 would be more of the consolidation of gains and transitioning to community. So these are not mutually exclusive, but rather more so our primary area of focus. Where we're a little bit different than some other treatment centers is that we do introduce the phase 1 work, absolutely, but we get into treating the underlying issues, working with the fire a little bit more quickly. And we do this for a couple of reasons. So one would be quite often the clients that we work with have many experiences happening in their lives, many daily experiences, traumas, stressors, and we could just treat what's coming up. But when we do that, we're just clearing up a little bit of space in their nervous system. What we really want to focus on is what's taking up the most amount of energy, space, activation for them. Quite often, that's what is coming up in their intrusions, right? In re-experiencing bad dreams, nightmares. And we want to work through that in a safe, structured way. And when we work on some of those bigger issues that are kind of running in the background, they often are amplifying the day-to-day stuff. So it might not be the stuff that's drawing our attention right now consciously, but a lot of times they work as amplifiers where in the background I have these early childhood experiences, these early templates, and essentially what these are neural networks of association that when something happens in the present, it's reinforcing that pattern for my brain, my body, my nervous system that says, yeah, this is just like this experience and this experience and this experience. And there's all of this reinforcement that's happening. Um, Yet, you know, the treating what's happening right now may help with what's happening now, but it's not necessarily going to have the biggest impact it could, right? So the next time something like that happens, we're going to again have that amplified response because that's what the body has learned. This is what we do in this moment, or the brain has learned this is what we do in this moment. So we do get in there and treat the trauma in a safe, structured way. I'll talk about our model in just a little bit here. And then after we've gotten through the bulk of the processing work, that's when we're really focusing on who are you as a person, right? The people that we're working with, who are they? What are their skills? What are their likes? What do they enjoy? Oftentimes when we're experiencing trauma and we're flipping that lid, we're in this state of like treading water where people are just trying to survive. So having a sense of who I am, what I like, what I do for fun is often not available to me because that's not where I'm living. I'm just trying to survive, right? This day, this moment, this second. And what we're doing when we've cleared out some of that trauma is starting to shift into some of the future forward thinking. So when we look at that phase one work, we're introducing some techniques, some resources that can promote a sense of safety. We're helping the nervous system to re-regulate. The model that we use, our integrative trauma and attachment treatment model, is naturally grounding. We're working at reconnecting with the body in a safe, structured, titrated way, kind of dipping our toe in a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time from that sensory rather than cognitive level. As we're doing that and providing some psychoeducation and increased awareness, mindful awareness of what's happening, we start to see a greater effect on stabilization and symptom reduction. Ultimately, we're working at increasing integration. So all forms of trauma and stress decrease integration. So again, we have right hemisphere, left hemisphere, if we look at the brain bilaterally. And what we're doing is trying to increase the crosstalk between right and left hemisphere. Trauma really significantly decreases integration. All forms of abuse decrease integration. And essentially, the way that the brain forms memory is different when it comes to trauma as well. So trauma memories don't typically have that beginning, middle, and end and sequence and flow to them. Instead, the brain hyper attunes to what are called central details that are considered central to survival, which is why we may have islands of memory or gaps in our memory. And basically, the brain is hyper attuning or super encoding the information that it views is relevant to survival. So part of the work that we're doing is working through in a safe, structured way our experiences. Um, and we're not typically using talk because the research is showing us that in brain scans, right hemisphere is busy and active at work. So sight, sound, smells, sensations of touch, the activation in the body, the experience of trauma is largely right hemisphere. Left hemisphere are speech centers, so Broca's area, Wernicke's area, And that higher order part of our brain is largely offline. So there's little to no activity happening there, which is why we often want to start with the body and then bring that arousal down and start working at a more cognitive level. So, when we look at the trauma processing and reappraisal, the model we primarily use at our center is the integrative trauma and attachment treatment model. And this model is a layered integrative approach that layers in multiple modalities and layers that work for treating trauma to regulate the body, the brain, and the mind simultaneously. It's a very rich integrative approach with components of sensory processing, somatic therapy, resource installation, bilateral stimulation, sensory regulation. And then after we've kind of brought that arousal down, that's when we're doing some of that cognitive reframing or new meaning making, followed then by some energetic work to kind of shift out that big energy in the body. It is intentionally layered in a way that allows for processing trauma in a safe, structured way, discharging excess stress and excess energy, completing incomplete responses in a safe, structured way, resourcing the body and mind, and forming new meaning. One of the things that people will often describe after processing is that, their memory feels more distant. It feels changed. It feels further away, right? It doesn't take away what happened. There's nothing that can take away what happened, but our model is designed to take away the charge, the terror component, or the activation component that can keep those trauma memories stuck and feeling like we're kind of re experiencing. It seems that as we're working through things in a safe, structured way, it's also increasing integration and allowing that memory to be put away in proper space and time. So instead of feeling like it's just perpetually reoccurring and we're looping in that threat and that pain and that hurt, that memory can be put away in proper space and time. And I can look at things a little bit differently. Once we've effectively been able to do that, then we can start looking at that transitioning back to community, connection to self, connection to community, connection to who I am as a person. And ultimately, what we're doing at this time is reinforcing new neural pathways, right? New neural networks, even over time of association. And one of the techniques that I really like for this is the heal technique. And this is kind of woven into our model as well towards the end. But Rick Hansen has a heal approach. Now, I describe it a little bit differently than he does, but it's an adaptation of this. And he says we need to first have an experience, right? If we want to create or cause the brain to fire and wire in a different way or create a different response, we need to first have an experience. So he says we need to have an experience, real or created, doesn't matter. Our brain doesn't differentiate between um, something actually happening or us creating this, right? Our brain doesn't differentiate between somebody being with us or us imagining that they are, which is why visualization and imagination can be so incredibly powerful or so incredibly painful. So we're looking at using it as a resource, right? So we need to have an experience. I often say a counter experience, real or created. Then we want to enrich that experience. So we will often try to enrich it by taking it in with our senses: sight, sound, smells, sensations of touch, right? How would it feel, for example, to experience empowerment if feeling weak is what I typically feel? And I'd really just notice and take it in with my senses. We would then absorb it. Now, we can absorb it by going deeper into the body, by imagining what that experience would be like and how people would respond, what our body posture would be like, and seeing things play out the way that we need and want it to. Or we can absorb it by tapping it in. And this is based on Laurel Parnell's work. EFT uses this as well. There are lots of different approaches that use tapping as a form of bilateral stimulation, but I'm trained in Dr. Laurel Parnell's attachment focused EMDR model, and I really love a lot of the techniques and the model itself. So one of the things that she teaches in the book Tapping In, which is a great resource for anyone, is that we can tap in new affective states, or we can tap in these visualizations or experiences. And it just seems to bring it from up here in our thinking brain into down here in our body. So it makes it a little bit more visceral, a little more integrative, a little more embodied. And what we're doing is bilaterally stimulating the brain. So we're stimulating right hemisphere, that emotional felt state, embodied awareness, and left hemisphere, right? That higher order thinking part of the brain at the same time. So for the absorb, we'll usually tap it in. And we don't have to tap up here. We can tap, it's just easier to demonstrate there, but we can tap on our legs, right? On the top of our knees. We can tap our feet or even on our sides. But the idea is that it's one hand, then the other, not both at the same time. We're alternating. The next step is what I consider to be one of the hardest steps, and that's linking. The linking occurs through repeated pairing. So every time those old messages of I'm so weak pop up, or I can't do this, I can't manage this, right? And there's all these other experiences that reinforce that because that's just what I've learned to be true. I need to be able to notice that and go, yes, yes, there is that. There is that. I have those experiences, but I also have this experience. And then call to mind that actual or created experience of maybe empowerment, right? Or of moving towards healing in my journey. So yes, I have tremendous pain, but I also have this. I'm engaging maybe in therapy and learning new ways of thinking and relating and being in my body. And maybe there was a moment, just even a moment, where I felt something shifted. So we need to have that experience, right? So I'm going to draw my attention away from all those old patterns and redirect it to maybe the hope or the empowerment. Then I'm going to enrich it by taking it in with my senses, right? Really getting a good sense of what that feels like and absorbing it at an embodied way by tapping it in. And over time, the repeated pairing of that old neural network of association activating and that redirection and amplified attention to those new associations is what causes those old neural pathways to unhook and new ones to be formed. And that's based on the concepts that neurons that fire together wire together. So I hope this will be helpful for you to give you a little bit of an understanding about what we do, how our model works. We often get questions where people are worried or fearful about doing this work, and I completely understand that. Nobody wants to do trauma processing, or very few people do. However, when we're working through it in a safe, structured way, it's just giving us greater agency instead of being stuck, looping, and kind of um, stuck in that experience, which often is very debilitating, very overwhelming. There's, a reinforcement of that loss of control and powerlessness that's often happening. Instead of that, what's happening is we're gaining agency control, right? We're gaining a better ability to notice what's coming up and recognize, oh, I know where this is coming from. I know what this is. That was then. This is now. This is what I know to be true now, and we're having a better ability to relate and respond in ways that feel good for us and that are reflective of what is happening right here and right now, as opposed to the residual of what happened before being reinforced in the present. So I do hope that's helpful for you. We've got lots of resources on our YouTube channel. I'd encourage you to have a look at them. We hope to post some other video resources and do lots of custom trainings as well. So for agencies and organizations to help them become trauma informed and also to help them learn how to use our model. There's some information about the program evaluation that was done with our model as well that can be informative if you're wanting to look at some of the research around this. And yeah, I just wish you a gentle rest of your day and thank you for listening. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day.